Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour. We're guessing you are joining us straight after the final head-to-head debate of this general election. From now until December the 12th, the only thing that can really shift the polls is you guys knocking on people's doors and telling them why they should vote for hope and socialism over, I suppose Boris Johnson calls it getting Brexit done, but we know that this is going to be years of wrangling with the United States and potentially selling out our public services. So there's all to play for. In terms of that debate, it wasn't the most scintillating TV I've ever watched, but you can go knocking on those doors knowing that our leader, your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has straight glasses this time around. So he looked prime ministerial, but I mean, in my opinion, somewhat of a truce. Obviously, we'll break it down as we go along. I'm joined this evening by James Butler.
Good evening.
How did you find that hour-long experience?
Yeah, I mean, so I've always been sort of very skeptical about these debates in general. They're a sort of American import into politics, and actually people have been, leaders have been very hostile to them in the past. I actually thought this one was fine. I actually thought it was maybe, I think, less interesting, but also sort of perhaps a little more informative than the previous ITV one. Like you, I felt most of it was a dead heat. I thought it became most interesting in that 5 minutes sort of towards the end where you got some conversation, actually some back and forth, some real disagreement there in the room. And then I think the closing statements were interesting as well. I do think it is significant that the Tory closing statement, repeated the mantra, the get Brexit done, but also went very heavy on the sort of negative attacks here. And this is, I think, characterising the Tory approach in these sort of last few weeks of the campaign. I think it's also going to characterise the next 6 days as well. I thought, Corbyn's final piece to camera, I thought was strong. I thought it was very clear and a message of optimism and hope. But for the rest of it, I mean, what was pretty clear was that both of them were really speaking past each other, right? They were speaking to their respective bases. This is why Johnson's going hard on get Brexit done. He's going hard, on attempting to undermine any sense that he's a threat in any way to public services. He knows that's very much a weak point for him. This is why Corbyn is also going very hard on the NHS, why he's also going very hard on public services. And I thought he could have gone harder. Didn't go hard enough, really, on linking Johnson to the Tory party. I mean, that was very clear at the beginning of the debate. But it's essential for him, really, in these next few days. It's essential for all of us, really, to be making very, very clear the point. So Johnson did this a lot, right? He said, I've only been in power for 130 days. Like, well, you've been a central pillar and a support of Tory governments for years and years and years and years. You were thrilled to argue about breaking, the monopolistic and monolithic NHS as a backbencher back in 2002. You voted enthusiastically for austerity. You voted enthusiastically for fox hunting. You voted, enthusiastically, on the sort of introduction, against sort of, funding social care properly, for, gutting councils. So it's all of this stuff I think is very, very important. And, obviously Corbyn was trying to do that a bit, and Johnson was very, very much rowing back away from it and trying to take the focus away from himself as a Tory. So that's what was going on there. Really, it wasn't a debate. It was addressing, through the medium of television, their respective bases. And at this point in the campaign, that's inevitable.
I was just thinking just before we went live, why? Because we've done 2 of these shows now straight after the debates. We didn't do one after the question time because, to be honest, I didn't realise it was going to be such a big event. The question time where you had the 4 leaders,
not the 7 dwarves,
who were asking 4 leaders, one after the other, answering questions from a live studio audience. And it's a shame we didn't do a live show after that because that was electric. And I was thinking, why is it that after both debates, which I think in both cases we said were fine, it was a bit of a truce. Jeremy Corbyn got his point across, Boris Johnson got his point across. Last time, it was a shame there was no real, zingers this time around. Last time there was Corbyn bringing the receipts about Boris Johnson in a trade deal with the Americans and talking about the NHS. He had a good line on that we'll go to later. But the receipts this time, which were fine, there's going to be some custom checks between Britain and Northern Ireland. Yes, I think that is something that actually could, cause damage in a general election. But it doesn't really fit with what are Jeremy Corbyn's values, which he is passionate about. When he's shouting at him about trading away the NHS with the United States, I mean, that ticks actually loads of Corbyn boxes. He's never been that keen on deals with the United States. He's a big fan of the NHS. And
I mean, there is this like long-standing division within the Labour Party, right? And it's a kind of instinctive cringe that attends like most Labour politicians, right? And it goes right the way back to, if you remember, and it come out, recently again. It's now a kind of line that Labour activists like to trot out about the Tories. They're lower than vermin. It's a quotation from a speech given by Nye Bevan just before the introduction of the NHS. But Attlee wrote to Bevan saying, "Oh, I wish you hadn't done that. That's very bad. Please stop doing that because you want to bring it in as a kind of consensus. We're respectable politicians. We're statesmanlike." And Bevan was like, "Yeah, but they are actually scum, though." But that division within the Labour Party has always been there, and it's that figuring out like how to have a class politics while also making yourself look like a party of government. It's a very difficult thing to do, and people tip from one way to another. Personally, always with me, I would always like to see more attack on the Tories. But that gets me going. It doesn't necessarily get everyone else going.
Well, I think when I started my previous point, I got distracted by talking about the NHS and the United States. But I think why the Question Time event was electric and the debate wasn't, is because the thing that's refreshing about Jeremy Corbyn and the reason he inspired people and the reason, he had a breakthrough and when he was running to be leader of the Labour Party, is that he answers questions quite honestly. So one thing that was quite impressive in that Question Time was he was asked, it was really niche, I don't know how this question got through, but someone asked him a question about Bolivia and why he'd sent out a tweet in solidarity with Evo Morales. And Jeremy Corbyn was just there, thoughtful, and he gave a sort of like 3-minute, very considered, obviously it was quite right, but he gave a 3-minute, very considered speech about Bolivia. He answers questions directly, and after that half an hour, you're like, well, there's a guy who just, he answers questions saying what he thinks. He seems very knowledgeable. You can ask him questions about anything, and he has sort of like a reasonably long answer that he can deliver to it, and which is fairly convincing. And I think that's why people see he's an honest guy. We can understand that. In a debate, as we saw today, it really is about message discipline, because it's very difficult to, I suppose, answer a question, in an honest, considered manner when, one, you only have 30 to 60 seconds to answer it, and two, when you're standing next to someone whose whole job is to trash it. So you do have to be, engaging more in a disciplined battle.
Absolutely. This is why I hate these debates. They're not debates.
Well, some people so Bernie Sanders is a more probably rounded politician than Jeremy Corbyn, because he can do both. He can do that sort of considered answer to a crowd of people where people are like, yeah, I really get his values, and he can do the message discipline. This is what I'm attacking you about. Because if Jeremy Corbyn was a bit more of an aggressive chap, you could have Labour message discipline in a debate like that, and it would be based on who do you stand for. So I think many of the answers that Boris Johnson gave, you can have the response, who is it that you stand for? When it comes to getting Brexit done, why are you so keen to get your deal through as quickly as you are? Let's look at your past. You were the person who said you have been kinder to bankers and you have been the best friend that bankers have had in this country. Why are we to trust you that when you are signing a trade deal, it is not going to be in the interest of the elites in this country when you are behind closed doors? He should also talk about his record. So whenever there's a topic which comes up about the NHS or probation, and Corbyn does do this, to be fair, but not in the personalised way that I think it needs to be, which is that you are standing here as a member of the Conservative establishment. You've been a leading figure in the party for the last 10 years. And for the last 10 years, this party has decimated our services. Everyone in this room understands this. Everyone watching at home understands this. And I think he could have returned to that slightly more often.
Well, this is exactly as I was saying. I think one has to be really relentless in making the case that this guy is not exceptional. He's not unusual. He's not, particularly distinctive. He might be a particularly execrable example of a Conservative politician. He might have a slightly more flamboyant line in Lies and Deception. He might have, a slightly... I don't find it charming, actually. I think various people in the press do, but I've never found it charming, this sort of bluster and sort of ill-concealed smirking and ill-concealed sort of fury and entitlement when he's called on these things. This is who this guy is. It's not very distinctive from the Tory party, and I think you have to make it very much about his political record, but also, there's nothing exceptional about Boris Johnson government. It's 130 days more of the same of what we've had for 9 years.
I think actually the first clip we were going to show is I can't remember if it's Boris Johnson giving a lie or Boris Johnson being called out on the hospital's lie. It's him being called out on the hospital's lie. We'll go to it in a moment. That's something that I think, Jeremy Corbyn was strong on, the Labour Party have been strong on and has cut through. People do understand that when Boris Johnson has made claims about the amount of hospitals that will be built or the amount of nurses that will be added to the NHS, they have been simply untrue. Where I think a greater connection could be made is it's not just that Boris Johnson is a pathological liar. So that's the narrative is often you can't trust this man, he's a pathological liar. But I think the answer could be more, of course he's lying. Of course, when this man said he was going to build 20 hospitals, of course, when this person who is as establishment as they come, who has never struggled in his life, who has always dined with the wealthy and drunk at drinking clubs in Oxford University. This is not a man who is going to redirect the resources of this country, as I would, to rebuild our NHS, which is the greatest social democratic institution we have. Of course he's lying. I think it would potentially land a bit more, and I'm sure people are doing this, on doorsteps throughout the country, which is, of course, he's lying because it's not in his interest to be building 40 hospitals or creating 50,000 new jobs as nurses in the NHS. I think maybe there was a trick that was missed there. But should we look at the clip anyway? So we're going to look at Corbyn calling out Boris Johnson on his hospitals lie.
The Prime Minister, the day after he was appointed, announced there was going to be 40 new hospitals.
Yes.
A week later, that became 20. A bit later on, it became 6 new hospitals. He seems to have a problem with the figures about hospital building in Britain.
Perhaps I could elucidate.
Please.
Well, perhaps I could elucidate Mr. Corbyn, who has a problem with coming up with his Brexit policy. But the reality is that we have a very clear agenda, which is to upgrade 20 hospitals, to build 40 new ones. It's perfectly true that the cash allocation for the whole hospital build is for 6 initially, but we're putting in the seed funding now so that they can do the architect's drawings, do the plans, do all the business case, so that in 10 years' time, as a result of the decisions taken just in the last 130 days by this government, there will be 40 new hospitals in this country.
Well, what's wrong with that is 12 hours or 15 hours after being appointed Prime Minister, he came to Parliament and grandly announced there was 40 new hospitals. It turned out there weren't. That's when he was asked where they were going to be. That was then reduced to 20, and then it became seed funding for 6. It's not credible to make those kind of statements and not be able to back it up with any serious plan.
We're back on. I'm going to go to you, resident boffin. Are there going to be 40 hospitals built or 6 hospitals built?
No, I mean it's not even 6 really. Only one of them really. The will count probably. This is the Whipps Cross refurbishment, which counts probably. It's so extensive as to count as a new hospital. Look, a lot of this.
The Whipps Cross is a shithole. That's my local hospital. Or it was my local hospital.
yeah. I mean, I know it well.
Fair play to all the staff, wonderful people, but that place is a shithole.
Yeah, no, look, this is very much in the line of, the same stuff that the Tory party has been saying about national insurance contributions, right? So they're going to raise them to 12,000, 12,500 being the income threshold at which you start paying national insurance. But then that turns out to have been an aspiration. And that turns out to actually not even be something that they intend to achieve within the life of a single parliament, so within the next 5 years. So lots of this is stuff that, it's not even in the pipeline. Same is true with the proposals to reverse the kind of beaching railway cuts. So these are the cuts that were, decimated British railway networks. Reversing those would be extremely expensive. They've only put 500 million into their budget for it. I think you would maybe get a stretch of one very short line there. But more importantly, in the government pipeline documents, they're not even there. They're not even doing the kind of basic research for them. The seed capital funding that Johnson is talking about there will go absolutely nowhere.
What's your take, I suppose, on why the Conservatives have, I suppose, fiddled with the truth so much when it comes to the NHS? I mean, the argument with the nurses, so that also came up, is there 50,000, are there 31,000 new nurses? One option for the Conservatives would have just been to announce 31,000 new nurses. That's uncomplicated. They are planning to introduce 31,000 new nurses. Why did they have to add on the extra 18,000?
It's curious.
Is there a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional game of chess that's being played that I don't understand?
Well, I mean, you'll hear messaging people say sort of 50 numbers are better than 30 numbers, stuff like that. So when you've got like a halfway to 100, that's better, whatever. I'm always pretty skeptical about that stuff, as if it's sort of like astrology for kind of political messaging. But look, I mean, the reason that, well, I mean, it's curious. Obviously, I don't have kind of psychic access to the inner workings of Tory strategists. But what I would what I would suggest is that they recognise that the 2017 manifesto contained a lot of problems for them, right? So the dementia tax being the most obvious one, but one of the reasons that dementia tax was so strikingly part of that campaign is because actually people have been talking about this manifesto as if it's really, really pared down. Actually, the last manifesto was pretty pared down, so it didn't have much policy in. This one has even less. It has sort of all sorts of concerning things, which maybe we'll come on to about amending or rewriting the Human Rights Act. That's in there in the Tory manifesto, very sort of unpleasant part of their kind of constitutional packages. But on the NHS, they recognise that it's a weak point for them. They recognise that it's always been a historic weak point for the Conservative Party, and more particularly that it's a strong point for the Labour Party. Now, I want to read something here. This is just very short. It's from a report written for a key Thatcherite entity within the Tory party called the Economic Reconstruction Group, in that kind of exciting Tory euphemism. This is back in 1977, so it's just before Thatcher comes to power. It's written by Nick Ridley, who was a chief architect of the poll tax. But he writes, and this is about nationalisations or denationalisation, privatisations. He says, denationalisation should not be attempted by frontal attack, but by preparation for return to the private sector by stealth. We should first pass legislation to destroy public sector monopolies. We might also need to take power to sell assets. Secondly, we should fragment the industries as far as possible and set up the units as separate profit centres. Now, this worked for Thatcherites in a lot of industries. NHS in particular needed that stealth approach. So they went in, they did things like privatised cleaners and stuff like that. And then it goes on, it gets taken up by Letwin and people like that in the late 80s. Colours the Blairite approach, frankly. But they know that that we're in a winter election, in which the NHS is an issue. There are more people using the NHS. There are more people, frankly, confronted with the reality of A&E waiting times. So they have to sound big and they have to sound generous on it. I was surprised about the 50,000 figure because it was so easily taken apart. Just as I was surprised by the kind of 40, the vanishing hospitals. I thought they'd be a little more cunning than that. But their hope, and it's not an unreasonable hope, is that people read headlines. They don't read details. They read headlines. I think it's come apart for them when they've gone on TV. So it seems to have cut through when Nicky Morgan is sat there and being told by, this is a lie so flagrant that even Piers Morgan recognised that it was a lie. Like, it really...
And that clip was viewed 7 million times.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is likely that that's cut through.
Yeah,
it wasn't just viewed 7 million times. Absolutely. It was shared and shared and shared.
The hope was that, the other side of this is that maybe through stuff like this, you create a huge ambiguity about the kind of promises that are being made in this election. And so you feed the sense that actually you can't trust any politician at all. So when Jeremy Corbyn comes and says, actually, the hope, the power to do this actually does rest in your hands, that you can do it, that you can, for perhaps the first time in your life, trust a politician, and then part of what they're doing with this kind of, squid ink approach to public policy is say, actually, you can't. Lies are everywhere. Lies are high up and low down in public places. They're in our manifesto.
Don't trust anyone.
Headlines. Don't trust anyone. And if you don't trust anyone, then come home to the Tory party.
I mean, that's the challenge, actually, I think, to Labour or any progressive, is how to... So let's put this a different way. The Conservatives know they're weak on the NHS and strong on Brexit. Well, strong on Brexit in that they've got a simple line which has some cut through. We might not think it's a particularly good policy, but they want to be talking about it. Sure. Now, you win as a Conservative after a debate if during the NHS part of the conversation people are confused and bored, and during the Brexit part of the conversation people know what's going on. Because they want people to be switched on at the Brexit part. And I suppose so long as we're debating, is it 31,000? Is it 50,000? Is it 4 hospitals? Is it... the moment seed funding is mentioned...
Which is why you go
so many
deeper,
people watching that debate.
You cannot be trusted.
Yeah, which is why you make it about values. So the task of the progressive is to make sure during that NHS section, people are thinking about values, people are thinking about whose side do people stand on, and they are clear about what struggle is going on. If you're having a debate about numbers in that part, I mean, we'd need to see polling on it, but what the Conservatives are going to 100% be hoping is that the NHS part people got a bit confused and bored, the Brexit part they were paying attention, and I suppose that could be the four-dimensional why you might.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to say about this is that election campaigns are also
about whether it's
like,
going to be 6 or 40 hospitals.
Election campaigns are also like extremely chaotic. So, you know, like it's quite possible. You know, it's always possible to attribute more coherence to the opponent than they actually possess. On the other hand, I do think there is a strong element, and there has been a strong element throughout this Conservative campaign, of really poisoning the public sphere. So poisoning the possibility of any politics at all is, you know, very much for them, they're hoping that this is a deeply, deeply anti-political election.
Let's go to a next clip. So I think the highlight of the last debate was Corbyn getting out the receipts about the US-UK trade deal and discussions about the NHS. There were more receipts today. Slightly less dramatic, but I mean, potentially it's had some cut through. Let's watch those and we will discuss them afterwards.
I do think we need a bit of openness from the government. We forced them to release the documents, or we released them for them actually, a week ago, which showed the access that the US were demanding to our public services. And today, the news came out of what's happening with Northern Ireland. And
briefly, Mr. Corbyn, for people who didn't hear the news, what are you claiming the documents show? And then we'll put it to Mr.
They show
Johnson.
quite clearly that there are going to be charges, there are going to be customs checks, there are going to be restrictions on trade between Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Boris Johnson.
Well, actually, that is not true. The whole of the UK comes out. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland together. We do free trade deals together. Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the UK, and we are united. And I have to say, I think it's a great opportunity for our country. And it says unfettered access, I think is what it says.
It says unfettered access, then all through it questions the fettering that will happen.
That is what we will have.
One at a time, please.
And what the document also says is that Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the UK. And, you know,
Isn't the problem, Mr. Johnson, that the DUP, the unionists who were your partners, they agree with him and not you?
Well, they don't actually, because our deal is a great deal.
I mean, if we're talking about trying to get stuff land by not having the public confused, when it went from the moment of they say they're going to have unfettered access and Corbyn says, well, they say unfettered access because there's going to be some fettering. What was going on in these particular documents, which were released dramatically in a press conference by the Labour Party this morning?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there was, you know, it's funny in some ways. It effectively demonstrates the things that we knew were going to happen with Johnson's deal in the Northern Irish context. You know, one of the key things there is about that border in the Irish Sea, that actually the kind of trade position of Northern Ireland will actually be very difficult, that there's risk of criminality, that, you know, and the new thing is that it's pretty clear that there will be actually quite significant bureaucratic impositions on movement between Britain and Northern Ireland. You know, the thing that is more striking to me about this is that it seems clear to me that Corbyn's team have learned that in order to get Britain's press to pay attention to something, you have to demonstrate that it comes, in secret document form, and you have to do it publicly, and you have to do it in front of the cameras. Almost all of this stuff. And it is detailed. It's important stuff, but it's the kind of important detail that actually should be at the centre of this election, because it gives the lie to the kind of stuff that's being claimed by the Conservative Party in public. It gives the lie to their historic commitment. I think you remember sort of going to reverse gear here for a little bit. You remember, it was probably about 12 months ago at this point, maybe even less actually, that you had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg standing up and calling the DUP the sacred guardians of our constitution. And of course, as always with these kind of effusive pieces of Tory praise, it turns out to be nonsense underneath, and it turns out to be, a convenient piece of rhetoric that they'll use to get whatever they want, because the Conservative Party, I think this is a mistake that the left often makes, the Conservative Party is interested in capitalism. It likes defending capitalists. It likes defending particularly those at the top end of the ladder. But what it is interested in more than anything else is power. And so it will very happily fuck over, people who have been very close allies to it in order to maintain its grip on power. It will lie, it will cheat, it will deceive. That's the nature of that party. It is a party, not of capitalism per se. It is a party of the ruling class. The British ruling class is weird, and so it does anything it can to sort of defend this. So it's a sort of weird alliance. Anyway, so back to these documents. There's nothing very, very surprising or very new there, but it's just been pretty clear to me that in order to get things to be part of a campaign, you have to demonstrate that they have emerged as part of a kind of secret leak or whatever. The people to really condemn here are not the BBC outright. I know we've had a kind of strong line in BBC bashing in this campaign. I think it's been necessary and important. I've turned, by the way, from those people who thinks like the left shouldn't talk about the BBC because like it makes us look mad, to really just wanting to destroy the BBC. But that's not true.
Reform the BBC.
I still there's
good
lots
as it
about
can be.
There's lots about the BBC I love. And, there are hugely important things that are done by the BBC, and I admire much of it intensely. But what frustrates me is the way that is the stance that its political editors especially take, which is that they think of themselves as insiders in the Westminster Village, and therefore think of politics from the standpoint of a politician. So they see their role as thinking. So you get this when reporting on polling, for instance. It's about which way are the voters moving out there, and how will we, as a political class, respond to it? Right. So it gets you get process stories about the stuff that's going on inside politicians. Actually, you would think, or you would hope, that their role ought to be to look at the stuff that's being presented more so than in any election that I can remember, even more so in 2017. You have very, very clear ideological divisions between the parties. And instead of saying, the parties are concerned about how voters will react to this, it's their job to put forward these differences and demonstrate what they might actually mean in practice. And yes, that will be difficult. In fact, if they were to actually do it, it would be difficult for both sides. I'm not going to pretend that's not true for 1 minute. There would be difficult questions to answer, but they're not even doing it at all. And that frustrates me, and it annoys me, and it frankly, it upsets me. It makes me miserable about the atrophied state of our public sphere, that these people can't do the very basic. So on this is the kind of stuff that gets talked about by these people as like, oh, nerdy detail that you don't need to do. Well, that nerdy detail is going to affect thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives and jobs, and the way in which they manage their day-to-day affairs. You had Boris Johnson wanging on about Freeport, in this debate.
Yeah, we haven't heard about Freeport. Did they?
He mentioned them.
They were a big feature at the start. Of
they
the
were a big
election
feature,
campaign,
and these are effectively deregulated zones. This is a serious change to the way in which
like Shenzhen province in
where
China,
the business is done in this country, and it's a negative one. It's a really negative one for a lot of people. Does it merit a mention? Do the details of these kind of checks, to the impact of this stuff merit a mention? Does serious scrutiny of what this actually means merit a mention? No, it merits a chortle on some absurd BBC pseudo podcast. I mean, what the fuck?
John,
sorry,
McDonnell was very good on BBC impartiality. Something that's not said that often. It's actually a really great line for a sort of left winger to say, which is that one of the reasons why BBC impartiality is on the decline is basically because of cuts. Because to have a genuinely independent and impartial broadcaster, you need them to have, I mean, they still do have the most researchers in the country if you go to any other sort of radio show, but they need to have the depth in their research team that they can set the agenda instead of following the agenda of billionaire newspapers. And so long as you cut them, then all you can have is people doing the fairly easy job of commentating on politics as opposed to, explaining and introducing people to the issues that genuinely matter and setting the agenda, which they could do.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Properly
also the
funded.
question of charter renewal, stuff like that. I mean, one of the things that's going to be weird after this election, the question of BBC funding will be up for debate really soon, the next couple of years. I think within the next 4 years. And it's going to be a lot of people who've been, kind of really appalled by the BBC. And they're people who've been naturally inclined to defend the need for a public service broadcaster. So, who knows? I mean, I think the BBC is important, it's valuable, it should be defended, it should be reformed. It should also feel less afraid of government, right? I mean, this is the other side of John McDonnell's point. Is the BBC feels afraid of government. Maybe not, the level of presenters, but at the executive level, the BBC is afraid of the government. And that's not a good situation for the press to be in.
Brilliant. Fox, our wonderful editor, has introduced into my document polling from YouGov. So we don't need to just hypothesize about what people might have believed. We have the results, and to be honest, they look quite good. Is this the whole thread? So, or have you just showed me the good ones to keep me in a good mood for all of them? So, on who came across as more likeable, this is from YouGov. Boris Johnson, 55%. Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, that's not good. 36%. I read it the wrong way around. Boris Johnson more likeable, apparently. Fuck. On who came across as more in touch with ordinary people, Jeremy Corbyn, 57%. Boris Johnson, 29%. On who came across as more prime ministerial, Boris Johnson, 54%. Jeremy Corbyn, 30%. Wow, I really did read those in sort of optimistic goggle glasses. There's one further up, is there? On who came across more trustworthy. This was the good one. This is why you made it bigger. Jeremy Corbyn on 48% and Boris Johnson on 38%. I suppose that is quite important, actually. And actually, that's not always been reflected in the polls. That is a change. Corbyn has done quite poorly when it comes to trustworthiness. Generally in polling throughout this campaign. I think partly because people saw him as being a bit shifty on Brexit, which he's not. But I do think sometimes he could have articulated their position a bit more proudly, especially actually in relation to this Northern Ireland point, right? So the point with the Northern Ireland customs checks is so long as people think that's a necessary part of Brexit, they're going to back it.
Yeah.
And Jeremy Corbyn's point should be, no, look, this you can have, and we will offer people the option of a Brexit where you don't have ridiculous customs checks within the United Kingdom. And the reason we won't have that is because we're not obsessed with leaving the customs union. And the reason we're not obsessed with leaving the customs union is because we don't want to form bargain basement deals with Donald Trump. And you can make this quite coherent narrative of why a Labour Brexit would actually be better than a Tory Brexit. There was also a question actually in the debate about why would your Brexit be better than Remain, which is potentially difficult for the Labour Party. But there is also a very easy answer, which is for Jeremy Corbyn to say, I can't remember what the actual answer here was, but for Jeremy Corbyn to say, what's different about Labour policy is we are willing to be honest to people and say there are pros and cons to both. We will negotiate a Brexit, which in some ways is a little bit worse than Remain, but in some ways is better. And we'll negotiate, well, we won't negotiate, but we'll have an option of Remain, which in some ways is worse than leaving and in some way better. I'm the only politician who can play the honest broker and admit that there isn't just one side which is all milk and honey and one side which is hellish misery, which is the kind of thing that Boris Johnson wants to tell you. I'm here to give you two acceptable options and try and bring the country together. I think that's a point that could have been made quite easily. The other side of it
is an even deeper one. Again, the same thing that we've been saying, throughout. The unifying feature here is trust. It's trust. You can't trust him. You can't trust Boris Johnson to, he's not going to tell you these things. He clearly hasn't told you these things. In fact, he said the complete opposite. Whenever it suited him to say the complete opposite. What else isn't he telling you?
That trustworthiness one is good, though, going into, I suppose, the final week of the campaign, because that means I think this is going to be the last head-to-head. Many people's opinions will be formed by now. And now when Corbyn goes up and makes his final pitches or his final announcements, people will hopefully believe them a bit more than sometimes they... Okay, we've got some more. Oh, who performed best during the section of the BBC debate on Brexit? You should get these up on the screen as well if you can manage, although I suppose I'm getting you to do too many things at the same time, aren't I? Apologies. On who performed best during the Brexit part of the debate, Johnson 62%, Corbyn 29%. On the NHS, Johnson 38%, Corbyn 55%. I mean, to be honest, I think people make their minds up before the debate starts on this, don't they? When you ask who did best on Brexit, they say, well, Johnson's the one who's good on Brexit, Corbyn's the one who's good on the NHS. Government spending, Johnson 48%, Corbyn 43%. Dead heat. Security, anti-terrorism, Johnson 55%, Corbyn 34%. To me, that looks like a lot of confirmation bias. Because there's no, you need to see a surprise for that to be interesting, whereas people have, it seems sort of, I suppose government spending, I suppose that's just a left-right thing, isn't it? Are you in favour of government spending and taxing or not? A ridiculous part of the debate, actually, I don't think we have a clip of this,
huge and absurd
was the one where Boris Johnson says taxation always falls hardest on people on lowest incomes.
I mean, this is
has he not heard of progressive taxation? Does he think the only form of tax is the poll tax? Was that the only point he pricked up his ears in? What did he do? Classics or PPE or
he did classics.
Classics. Yeah. I suppose they didn't do much tax. How did they tax the ancient Greeks? You probably know the answer to this.
I do know a bit about kind of you had sort of, it's one of the problems that really you had. I'm not going to get into.
Was it regressive taxation?
You have kind of tax farming that goes on in various iterations of empires, and it's one of the things that leads to the eventual collapse of various ancient states. Is actually the way in which taxation is collected, and then
taxation was very regressive in feudal times, right? Because people with privileges were, legally exempt, not like now where they're not legally exempt, but they just move it to the...
Sometimes they are legally exempt. I mean, one of the problems we have in this country is, for instance, non-domicile people who have, who live here but who have, who are formerly resident elsewhere. So when tax time comes around, they go, "Sorry, not me. I might physically be here, but I don't actually live here."
It's not legal privileges. It's just very good accountants.
I mean, I just think, I think it is legal privileges. Actually, I mean, this is the etymology of privilege is private law.
We're going to go to another clip in a moment, but first of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. You're watching Novara Media. It's a great pleasure to have you watching this show after the final head-to-head debate of the 2019 general election, momentous times. As you know, this show, this channel, this organisation is only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or pop us a little election bonus. Like this video, it means it appears in more people's feeds. Share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. Keep your comments coming. We'll go to your questions at the end. I think we're now going to watch a clip of Corbyn sort of landing a blow on Johnson when it came to those US-UK trade negotiations.
Now, you sent an email on behalf of the Labour Party saying, imagine opening a 5-figure bill for your cancer treatment. Do you accept that is totally misleading? There is no possibility of anybody having NHS cancer treatment and having to pay a 5-figure
If you end up with a privatised service, that's what you get. If you end up with that US trade deal, that is what you get. Now, the Prime Minister says he's not going to do that sort of a trade deal. If that's the case, why did the talks go on for 2 years? It doesn't take 2 years to say no to privatisation of the NHS.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
We're back. Oh, epic. It doesn't take 2 years to say no. That's a belter, wasn't it?
It's a great line. It's a great line, and it's true, and it's something I think that will resonate. There is something shifty about it, and there's been something shifty about the way in which the Tories have approached those documents and the question of trade with the United States. And it's, ultimately a thing that they can't get away from is that at the end or during the process of a trade deal, if you look at the kind of Korea-United States trade deal, again, took 7 years, as Corbyn was saying, to negotiate. Central to it was the question of drug pricing. US pharma, very, 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 very important to them is the question of drug pricing. It is also worth saying that the UK has actually relatively little that the United States wants. If something like access to a large market, which is it's a particular bugbear for Trump, but it's true actually of quite a lot of the United States trade establishment, is that there is this real resentment at these markets that they can't enter and inflate and exploit in the way that they do domestically.
It's a risky line in a prime ministerial debate, isn't it? Like, literally, guys, what else have we got?
It's true.
We make jack shit. Our markets are kind of small.
It's absolutely true. But in terms of things that the United Kingdom can actually offer as an inducement in a trade deal, it's actually pretty much the only one. I mean, maybe he can turn half of the country into a golf course or something. I don't know.
Let's talk about security.
Let's talk about
because we've got another clip.
It's so important.
This is kind of like a highlight show here. If there was another debate, you wouldn't have to watch it because you can just come here for the highlights and you miss all the faff. This is on security. Everyone always thought that would be a difficult topic for Corbyn. I think he handled it. This was fine, wasn't it? I shouldn't introduce clips by saying it was fine because it doesn't make them sound as exciting as one could make them sound. Let's rephrase this. In this clip, Corbyn destroys Boris Johnson on national security.
What is wrong with the idea that Boris Johnson spells out there that terrorists, particularly terrorists, should serve their full sentence?
You have to run a prison system and a judicial system in a proper way. You have to have a prison system that works. One day, pretty well all prisoners are going to come out at some point. But if you don't run a prison system that includes rehabilitation and you don't have a proper assessment of people before they're given any form of early release and a proper review of those cases, then there's obviously a danger to all of us. And so what happened on the streets of London was utterly appalling. And I was very moved by what Jack Merritt's father said about what his son was trying to do, that he wanted a society where you did address the huge problems where somebody committed awful acts like that, yes, of course you must imprison them. Yes, of course you must try and rehabilitate them if you can. But there has to be a monitoring process to achieve that. We need the security on our streets. Security doesn't come on the cheap. And if you cut the number of police officers, cut the number of PCSOs, privatise the probation service, underfund all the other aspects of the criminal justice system, then we all pay a price with our own security.
We're back. I'm going to find a way to do that sort of more crisply than me sort of like looking around and saying we're back, but we are back. Security doesn't come on the cheap. It was one of, I think, the strongest lines of the 2017 general election. He's brought it back up here. I suppose the fact that the Conservatives are saying they're going to give 20k or 20,000 more cops makes it slightly harder to land than when it was against Theresa May, who was sort of maintaining her proud austerity position, whereas Johnson is sort of trying to hide it away. But he survived, didn't he? Can there be anything more positive said about that particular part of the debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think positive and negative things can be said. The positive thing I would say is that actually he didn't take the approach that historic Labour leaders might have done, which is to cringe in the face of security questions and say, oh, actually, I also think the Human Rights Act should be abolished or changed or altered, which, by the way, is a promise that, despite what Boris Johnson was saying in that debate, the Tory manifesto contains a pledge to rewrite the Human Rights Act.
What are they going to do to it?
Well, I mean, like many of the Tory pledges, it's completely vague. It's part of their constitutional pledges that we need to look again at these things. But look, it seems pretty clear to me that the measure that they have in the Tory manifesto about seizing the property of Roma and Gypsies is going to require a revision of the Human Rights Act. Otherwise, it'd be challengeable in the ECHR, which, by the way, we are still a signatory to and that we don't leave after Brexit.
ECHR,
European
Court
Convention on Human Rights.
Not court.
There is an associated court.
Okay.
But yeah, no, so it would be absolutely challengeable in there because it's a basic infringement of human rights to confiscate property in that way. So, you're faced really, despite what Boris Johnson was saying there, you're faced with the frankly rather grim prospect of the cold hands of Priti Patel running through the Human Rights Act thinking, no, get rid of that one, get rid of that one, get rid of that one. And that's, that actually should be a pretty scary prospect. And let me say also, there is something hugely, hugely important about bringing back a social democratic approach to the question of security. And it's very difficult to do in a debate like this, but it should be a concern of the wider Labour movement to understand very, very clearly that crime and that, even some of the terrible crimes that are used to terrify people in the country when you resort to law and order rhetoric, these are primarily functions of political economy. Historically, almost all thinking on crime, violent crime especially, relates it very clearly to the question of the way in which a society is run, and in whose favour it's run, and the kind of the way in which we think, or the way in which we fund, or the way in which we support people's lives. Right? So this is something that's very, very clear from the early studies of policing. You go back to Patrick Colquhoun, you go back to Adam Smith actually, who says very similar. It's very rare you cite Adam Smith in this way, but Adam Smith says it. And that gets lost under Thatcher. Crime becomes, purely a question of individual, maleficence or moral responsibility. I think there's a role for that. But, we need to rethink the way in which we think about crime. And that includes thinking about actually, modern contemporary criminals. They're not just, the terrorist is the figure, par excellence of kind of criminality for the Tories, but we need to be thinking about crime in other senses as well. Where are, the human trafficker? Where is the, derivatives trader, the person who crashes an economy based on kind of, where's the LIBOR rigger? Where are the people who fucked the economy in 2008? Where are the people who are digital rip-off merchants? Where are the people who are phone scammers? So there has to be a rethinking of the way in which we conceive of crime in this country. And frankly, there's something that I find very, very frustrating about this conversation around crime, because there is an instinctive cringe, again on the part of the Labour Party, thinking about the way in which, actually people's lives are genuinely impacted here. That
would have been a nice pivot, actually. So sort of say, of course, we need to have a system whereby people don't leave prison when they're about to commit terrorist acts. Something clearly went wrong there, and we in government would deal with that. But let's also talk about the hundreds of thousands of people who have been affected by violent crime this year. Because yes, these exceptional terrorist events are appalling, and we need to, obviously something needs to change if someone's just got out on parole and they've killed a couple of people on a bridge. But we want to talk about crime across society, because I think that is often a working class issue.
Yeah.
That is also shied away from by the Labour Party.
It's my favourite line on Crime and Punishment, and it comes from a very unusual source. Right, so it's again a line from the 70s. It says, "We are not letting the public in on our era's dirty little secret that those who commit the crime which worries citizens most, violent crime, are for the most part the products of poverty, unemployment, broken homes, rotten education, drug addiction and alcoholism, and the other social and economic ills about which the police can do little, if anything. Rather than speaking up, most of us stand silent and let politicians get away with law and order rhetoric that reinforces the mistaken notion that the police, in ever greater numbers and with ever more gadgetry, can alone control crime." That's not some hippie lefty academic. That was Roberto Di Grazia, Commissioner of the Boston Police in 1976.
I was expecting more of a reveal than some guy I'd never heard of, but what he was.
This is the guy who was head of the Boston Police.
Head of the Boston Police. Still kind of niche, but I'll let you have it.
True, though.
I'm going to start collecting some of your questions, having a look at your questions. But whilst I do that, James, you were going to talk about the issue that was missing from this debate.
Okay. So, as always in these debates, it's very easy to get lulled into a sense that they go naturally through all the issues that matter, but they don't. Like what gets included and not included is really, really interesting. And what was not in this debate at all was climate change. And that, to me, is just staggering. This issue is, frankly, it dwarfs Brexit, which is a minor constitutional school in a third tier former imperial power. Climate change is the thing that is bearing down on us, I would say like a fucking iceberg, but that's definitely part of it. It's just insane to me that and the parties are so far apart on this that Labour has a climate change strategy that is serious and serious about actually tackling the problem in front of you, that says actually, guys, we have spent 30, 40, 50 years in total fucking denial about this, that this problem is not bearing down on us. Well, it's here now. It's already here. It's it's happening. Half of it is you think about the floods up in Yorkshire earlier in this campaign. That's part of it. You think about the kind of brutal summers that we've had in this country recently. You think of something like the thousands of excess deaths in France over the course of that last summer. That's part of it. You think of the way the profound ways in which it's going to shape our politics continually to come. And the Tories are going to sit on it until 2050. I mean, this is absolutely astonishing. Now, it's maybe, I don't know, maybe it reflects, I don't know, that people in that audience, in that BBC audience, wanted to talk about, I don't know, whatever it was, why we should abolish human rights or something like that. Who knows? I don't know where they find these people from. But it is the responsibility of journalists in situations like these to take these issues to the forefront. It's a huge, huge, huge division between the parties. And it's like, do you want your children to live on a planet like this in which the survival of the species is an open question? Because that's what it means if you're waiting till 2050 to deal with this stuff, right?
This isn't a question, but I like it. From Nemov. I like how James always seems slightly miffed at everyone else not being on the same galaxy brain level as him. That's what it often feels like being in the Novara Media studio, I have to say.
That's not true.
To be honest, it wouldn't matter because we come in here at very different times. You come in at about... What time do you come in to record your The Burn?
Well, this morning I was in just after 5 a.m.
And then I come in at about 6 p.m, so we don't actually cross paths that often. Always a pleasure when we do, of course. Even if you do sometimes seem miffed that I don't share your same galaxy brain level knowledge about previous chief police officers in American cities from decades gone by. Cyril Potapov. What are our leading messages right now on the doorstep? You go first.
NHS. Hugely, hugely important. Right?
That's not a line, though. What are you going to say about
line. No.
What's your argument? What are you going to say to the doorstep person?
What am I going to say to
the resident?
Person?
What are you going to say to the resident? The voter?
It always seems odd to me when people open the door and go, Boris is selling the NHS. What are you going to do about it?
No, but the art of canvassing is you have to ask some questions that allow you to make your point, to make your pitch.
Yeah. So yes, I know. Despite being up in the early mornings, I've been doing a bit of it myself.
You're not supposed to tell them about quotes from 70s police chief officers.
Well,
days.
this is. I managed to discipline myself in my sort of eccentric ramble through actual history and the way that politics has been conducted on this planet over the course of the past century. But yeah, no, I mean, so it's where were we? We were talking about lines on the doorstep. Yeah, no, okay. So I really do think the key one now is about trust, and it's about trust in public services. It's about trust in the NHS, and it's even about trust on Brexit as well. I mean, I think you've really got to. It's not always appropriate on the doorstep, but where it's possible and where it's necessary, I think it's really helpful to point to the kind of not just the documents, but to point to the entire conduct of not just Boris Johnson but the Conservative Party more generally, and say you can't. These people lie. They've lied again and again and again. It's pretty clear from the documents that have come out that they've lied about what this Brexit deal is going to do. You cannot trust them to do it. Whereas the Labour Party has made a very clear commitment and laid out exactly how it's going to do it, and here it is in these easy 3 steps. So I do think neutralising Brexit on that sense is important, and moving on, to wider questions, because this is going to be a 5-year parliament. Well, if it's a hung parliament, there'll probably be a general election, maybe May next year, I think is quite likely. But it could be a 5-year parliament. You've got to think about the next 5 years.
I agree that the argument has to be about trust, but not in the way that sometimes. So sometimes the way the argument is about trust is that you don't know how many kids he's got.
No.
Or he has a tendency to lie and fib, and sometimes what he says isn't quite true. I think the issue about trust should be, and is in fact, that the next prime minister of this country, if they get a majority, is going to be one of the most powerful prime ministers we've had in a very long time, because they get to set the political economic agenda of the country for decades to come.
Nice.
If they're signing a trade deal with the United States, they get to decide the relationship between our public services and other governments. And they're the kind of things that it's actually quite difficult to undo for parties in the future. So whilst in normal times you might think, oh, fine, we'll just have this bumbling guy for 15 oh my God. This bumbling guy for 5 years, he'll get Brexit done, which many people on the doorstep want, and then we can sort of move on. This isn't just a 5-year project. If Boris Johnson, and the problem isn't that he just happens to lie, the problem is that he is a person who has consistently been on the side of the establishment, the side of bankers, who doesn't give a shit about ordinary people, never has done, which is why they have to hide him from ordinary people after the fact that in the first week of the campaign, they sort of tried taking him out in public. It didn't go very well. And now he's being hidden. He's under wraps. He won't be under any scrutiny. And then he's going to go into negotiations with the United States with Donald Trump. And ultimately, well, you say crumble, but that would be the wrong way of describing it, because he's not going in there even attempting to say no about the NHS. He's going to go in there saying, like, look, Mr. Trump, I know that we have to, you know that I've got some difficult voters at home, so whatever I give you on the NHS, we're going to have to dress up like it's not actually me giving you that much, even if it does allow you over the longer term.
See that in those documents. They're taking cues from US trade negotiators on how to sell chlorinated chicken into the country. It's like that, it's not just something that's going to happen in the future. It's already happening. It's happened under the Conservative Party, that they're going snivelling to the United States on how to flog off this kind of terrible, really poorly treated and, frankly, very, very unpleasant food products to the United Kingdom.
The answer to this question is no. I'm going to read out the question there. Raging Platypus question: is our best hope to disqualify the Tories on account of electoral fraud, overspending and misinformation? No. Not going to happen.
No.
You have to win the election on arguments. You have to win the election on speaking to people before it happens.
Can I just say,
This
is really important, because it's not to denigrate our questioner in any way, because I understand where the question comes from, but there is a political consequence to this kind of stuff, and it's the kind of political consequence that was really noxious and really dangerous in the legal challenges over Brexit, when you had these kind of like Remainer lawyers chortling along to court, trying to find some loophole, some technicality, from which, with which to undo Brexit. Now, look, I'm all for judicial scrutiny. I'm for judicial review. I think the courts have an incredibly important role in keeping Parliament honest. This, by the way, is something Boris Johnson wants to do away with as well. But it has political consequences. It has political consequences not to the people who are like mostly okay with that kind of stuff happening. It has political consequences to people who feel like they'd never won anything in their life before, that they were people whose desires, whose hopes for a decent life, or even hopes to be taken politically seriously, even to be recognised as a political constituency, which incidentally the Blair government holds a great deal of responsibility for, even to be recognised as people with meaningful political voices, got nothing and got nothing and got nothing, got ignored and ignored and ignored, and then they won something. And the same people who ignored them for years and years and years go to the courts to take it away. That has a political consequence. You have to win. You have to win politically. You can't win through legal means. It's just so politically dangerous.
A related question actually is you can't win an election by saying it's not fair. And that does put the left in quite a difficult position when it comes to the BBC, because there is a tendency, and it's very difficult to resist, to just spend a lot of time being incredibly outraged at biased reporting on the BBC, but that probably doesn't win that many votes.
I don't think it wins many votes. I'm
not saying you shouldn't do it, because if it's true, you should speak out about it.
I think it has an important role in making things better, not get worse than they are. That there are people who shout back at these people. I do think that it's fair to say that the rules on impartiality in this election have been bent and even at times broken in ways that are unusual and in some ways unprecedented in a British electoral campaign. That is not just the fault of the BBC. It's not just the fault of kind of rather supine and uncritical political editors. It's also the fault of the politicians themselves, and especially Boris Johnson.
The comments is now, and I say this in the kindest way, degenerated would be the wrong word, but there's lots of people debating MMT, modern monetary theory, and I have promised you an actual show on that, and I am going to get an MMTer in after the general election. But just in our election coverage, I say when you're explaining complicated things, you're probably not winning the election. If you're telling voters whether or not money is real, I don't know, that's probably a not particularly polite way of talking about MMTs, but we're going to get on a proper MMT and we're going to have a proper debate about it after the general election when we have a Labour government, because then it will be a key question in the Bank of England at that point. Do they appoint an MMTer, or do they appoint, what's the opposite of a modern monetary theorist?
I shouldn't speak about this.
Okay. Final question, James. What is your favourite Bakunin quote? You've stumped me, actually. I'm suddenly gone completely blank. Okay, new question. You can think of I don't have any for you. Who is going to be the Portillo of this election?
Oh, okay. I mean, that's a super interesting one. Portillo of this election. I don't think it's going to be Boris Johnson. I think he'll probably retain his seat. I think it might be quite close, but I think he'll retain his seat. Who knows? I think possibly Ian Duncan Smith. That is the one that I'd really like. I'd really like IDS to go. I think it's unlikely. The other one is Dominic Raab, right? Mm-hmm. So the recent polls.
Doesn't that rely on loads of Lib Dems?
Enormous amounts of... No, it involves amounts of tactical voting for Lib Dems.
For Lib Dems. But what I mean is just I just don't see if there's a momentum behind the Lib Dems to beat Dominic Raab.
I mean, I think in that particular constituency, I think it's possible, but I think it's quite unlikely. Yeah. So
in a by-election, I think he'd lose. In a general election, no, because this whole tactical voting thing gets basically...
I agree. Of course, the Bakunin line, which is also associated with my favourite, indeed the only comic book that I've ever really enjoyed, is one that's quoted by the hero very early on. It's I never know. I've never seen the original of the quote, by the way, but it gets paraphrased throughout kind of 19th century anarchism as well. Is that the passion for destruction is also a creative passion, right? It's that sense, and it's very common among in the 19th century left, which is that sense that actually it's there in the slightly later than that song Solidarity Forever. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, right? That sense that actually that our criticism, and it's something that sometimes I think the left in Britain could do with a bit more of, actually, is to understand that institutions are not in themselves sacred. Norms were made to be changed, and that actually we should perhaps respect a little bit more that impulse
To destroy.
to understand that sometimes it's necessary for things to pass away in order to build new ones.
I like it. I like that. Which was the quote? Now that we've got, what was the Bakunian quote?
Oh, the passion for destruction is also a creative passion.
Great. Take that attitude out onto the doorstep.
I mean,
Does that work?
I think that's probably not one
Maybe
to
don't.
canvass with, but
Yeah, keep to the lines we said before about this being a key election. Boris Johnson is going to have a lot of power, and he is going to negotiate a trade deal with the United States for the interests of the elite, the business class, not the interests of ordinary people. And he's going to fold when he's talking to Donald Trump, not so much because, well, partly because he's weak, but also because he doesn't give a shit about ordinary people. All right, let's leave it there. We will be back same time, same place on Monday. We're doing nightly Tisky Sours until Thursday, at which point we will have a 6-hour long, at least, election sesh as the results come in. Thank you, James, so much for joining me this evening.
it's a great pleasure as always.
Thank you to our Tisky Sour viewers. This is the final weekend before the election campaign. Go out, talk to as many people as you possibly can, because it will. And hopefully we'll be commenting on the difference you have all made on Thursday when the results
and
are...
by the way, what I should say is email me with stories from the doorstep for the burner, which goes out obviously every morning at 7:30 on our Telegram channel, and also makes its way to our SoundCloud a little bit after that. But I want to hear from you. I want to hear everything that's going on and what your experiences are over the course of this weekend while you're canvassing.
And go to support.novaramedia.com so we can keep doing what we do. Good night.